I never thought my retirement would involve battling a homeowners association, but life has a funny way of surprising you. My name is Robert Harrison, a retired military veteran of 32 years, and this story begins in the beautiful Texas suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, where I settled down 5 years ago, in 2018. After decades of moving from base to base, serving my country in conflicts across the globe, I was ready for some peace and quiet. Willow Creek seemed perfect: tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and a sense of community that reminded me of the small town where I grew up. The houses were modest but well-built, and the HOA fees seemed reasonable for the amenities they provided. I purchased what I believed was a simple single-family home on a quarter-acre lot. The house itself was nothing spectacular. A 3-bedroom, 2-bath brick ranch that had been built in the early 2000s. But the backyard, that was something special. It backed up to a small wooded area that gave me privacy and a sense of tranquility I hadn't experienced in years. The first few years were exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent my days puttering in my garden, reading on the back porch, and occasionally chatting with neighbors over the fence. I'd even joined the neighborhood watch program, putting my military background to good use helping keep our community safe. Looking back, I should have known something was amiss when the HOA board seemed unusually interested in my property. They were always asking questions about the boundary lines and making comments about how fortunate I was to have such a large backyard. At the time, I just thought they were being friendly neighbors. Have you ever had a feeling that something wasn't quite right, but you couldn't put your finger on it? That's exactly how I felt during those first few years in Willow Creek. What I didn't know then was that my peaceful retirement was about to become a battlefield of a different kind, one where the weapons would be property deeds, municipal records, and the law instead of rifles and tactical gear. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped into my mailbox along with the usual junk mail and bills. The envelope was official looking, bearing the Willow Creek Homeowners Association letterhead. I opened it while sipping my coffee on the porch, expecting perhaps a notice about upcoming landscaping or the annual neighborhood barbecue. What I read made my coffee taste like ashes in my mouth. "Dear Mr. Harrison," it began. "This letter serves as formal notification that your property at 1247 Oak Street is currently in violation of Willow Creek HOA regulations regarding unauthorized use of common areas. Our records indicate that approximately 0.15 acres of land currently maintained as part of your backyard property is, in fact, designated as common area belonging to the HOA. I read the paragraph 3 times, trying to make sense of it. They were claiming that a significant portion of my backyard, nearly half of it, wasn't actually mine? That couldn't be right. I'd had the property surveyed when I bought the house, and the boundary lines were clear. The letter went on to demand that I cease all use and maintenance of the disputed area and restore it to its natural state within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in fines of $100 per day, plus legal fees if they were forced to take action. I sat there for a long time, the morning sun warming my back, as I tried to process this information. My military training kicked in. Assess the situation, gather intelligence, plan your response. This wasn't an enemy combatant, but the principles were the same. Never act without full information. That afternoon, I drove down to the county records office. I wanted to see my property deed with my own eyes. The clerk was helpful, pulling up the records and printing me a copy. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it. My property clearly included the backyard in question, with a boundary line marked by a row of ancient oak trees. So why was the HOA claiming otherwise? I decided to pay a visit to the HOA president, a woman named Margaret Thompson, who lived 3 streets over. Margaret was in her late 60s, the kind of woman who always appeared to have just stepped out of a beauty salon, with perfectly coiffed hair and impeccable makeup. She greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Robert, so good to see you," she said, ushering me into her immaculate living room. "What can I do for you today?" I showed her the letter I'd received. "Margaret, there seems to be some mistake. According to my property deed, this land is mine." Her smile tightened. "I'm afraid there's no mistake, Robert. When the original developer created Willow Creek, that land was set aside as common area for future development. It was never intended to be part of any residential lot." "That doesn't make sense. I replied, keeping my voice level. I've been maintaining that area for 5 years. I built a garden there, put up a fence. No one ever said anything before. She shrugged, a gesture that seemed dismissive rather than apologetic. The previous board was lax in enforcing the regulations. We're trying to bring everything into compliance now. I left Margaret's house feeling frustrated and confused. Something didn't add up, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. As I drove home, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just roll over on this. If the HOA wanted a fight, they'd come to the right man. What would you do if your HOA tried to take away part of your property you'd been using for years? Would you fight back or just give in? Back home, I spread all my property documents across the kitchen table. There was the original deed from when I purchased the house, the surveyor's report, and the title insurance policy. Everything indicated that my property included the disputed land. I decided to dig deeper into the history of Willow Creek. The development had been built in the early 2000s, during the housing boom. A quick search online revealed that the original developer was a company called Texan Dream Properties, which had gone bankrupt during the 2008 financial crisis. The next day, I returned to the county records office, this time asking to see the original plat maps for the Willow Creek development. The clerk, a patient woman named Brenda who seemed to enjoy a good mystery, helped me locate the documents. As we spread out the large maps on a table, something immediately caught my eye. The original plat showed the common areas in green, and my property clearly ended at the row of oak trees exactly where my current deed indicated. But then Brenda found something interesting. There was an amendment to the plat, filed about a year after the original, that appeared to redraw some of the boundary lines. It was this amended plat that the HOA was citing as evidence that my backyard was actually common area. That's odd, Brenda remarked, pointing to the amendment. This was filed by Texan Dream Properties, but it's not signed by a surveyor, and there's no record of it being submitted to the City Planning Commission for approval. I leaned in closer. You mean this amendment might not be legitimate? Brenda shrugged. I can't say for certain, but it doesn't follow the proper procedures for amending a plat. Normally, these things require public notification, planning commission review, and city council approval. There's no record of any of that happening. This was the first break in the case. The HOA was basing their claim on a document that might not even be legally valid. I thanked Brenda and made copies of everything, including the amendment that lacked proper signatures and approvals. Armed with this information, I requested another meeting with the HOA board. This time, I faced all 5 board members in the community clubhouse. Margaret presided, flanked by her allies on the board. I laid out my findings calmly and methodically, showing them the original plat and the questionable amendment. The county records clerk pointed out that this amendment wasn't properly filed or approved. I concluded, it seems to me that this document has no legal standing. Margaret's expression was unreadable. The HOA's legal counsel has reviewed these documents and determined that the amendment is valid. We stand by our position. I couldn't help but notice that she avoided addressing the specific issue of the amendment's legitimacy. Margaret, with all due respect, if this amendment wasn't properly filed, it's not legally binding. That means my property lines are exactly as stated in the original plat, which includes the land you're trying to claim. Another board member, a man named Gerald, who I knew to be a real estate attorney, spoke up. Robert, these matters are more complicated than they appear. There are also issues of adverse possession and estoppel to consider. I leaned forward. Are you suggesting that because I've been maintaining this land for years, it might actually strengthen my claim to it? Gerald shifted uncomfortably. That's not what I said. I'm merely pointing out that property law can be complex. The meeting ended at an impasse. The HOA board refused to withdraw their claim, and I refused to cede the land. As I left the clubhouse, Margaret called after me. Robert, don't make this difficult. It would be in everyone's best interest if you just complied. Her tone wasn't friendly anymore. It was a threat, plain and simple. Do you think Robert should continue fighting the HOA or give in to their demands? Vote now. The following weeks were tense. I received 2 more letters from the HOA, each more threatening than the last. The fines were accumulating, now totaling over 3-0. They also threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't remedy the violation. I consulted with a real estate attorney recommended by a friend from my military days. Tom Reynolds was a bulldog of a lawyer in his late 50s, with a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. "Bob," he said after reviewing all the documents, "they're bluffing. This amended plat is worthless without proper approval. But that doesn't mean they won't try to make your life miserable." "What are my options?" I asked. Tom leaned back in his chair. "We could file a lawsuit to quiet title, asking the court to officially recognize your property boundaries. Or we could wait for them to make the first move, and then counter-sue. Either way, it's going to get expensive." I nodded slowly. "I have some savings set aside. This is my home we're talking about. I'm not going to let them bully me out of what's rightfully mine." Tom smiled. "Good, because I suspect there's more to this story than they're letting on. Why would the HOA suddenly decide this land is common area after all these years? What's their real motive?" That question stayed with me as I drove home. What was the HOA's endgame? Why were they so determined to claim this particular piece of land? I got my answer sooner than I expected. A week later, I noticed surveyors marking off the disputed area behind my house. When I went out to ask what they were doing, they told me they'd been hired by the HOA to conduct a topographical survey. That evening, I ran into my neighbor, Susan, while walking my dog. Susan had lived in Willow Creek for nearly 20 years and knew the community's history better than anyone. "Robert, have you heard the rumors?" she asked, lowering her voice. "What rumors?" "About the HOA planning to sell off some of the common areas to a developer. Something about building townhouses on the unused land." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You think that's what this is about? They want to claim my backyard so they can sell it?" Susan nodded. "It makes sense. That wooded area behind your house is one of the last undeveloped parcels in the neighborhood. If they can reclassify it as common area, they can sell it without having to get every homeowner's approval." This changed everything. The HOA wasn't just being bureaucratic or difficult, they were attempting to steal my property for financial gain. And if they were willing to do this to me, how many other homeowners might be at risk? The next day, I called Tom and told him what I'd learned. "We need to act fast," I said, "before they can make any moves to sell this land." Tom agreed. "We'll file for a temporary injunction to prevent them from taking any action regarding the disputed property until the matter is resolved in court." As we prepared the legal paperwork, I decided to do some more digging into the HOA's activities. I submitted a public records request for all HOA board meeting minutes from the past 5 years, as well as any correspondence with developers or real estate agents. What I discovered was shocking. Not only had the board been discussing the potential monetization of underutilized common areas for over a year, but Margaret Thompson, the HOA president, had been in regular communication with a development company called Sunrise Properties. The emails suggested a plan to identify and reclassify various parcels of land throughout the neighborhood for future development. But the most damning discovery was a series of payments from Sunrise Properties to a consulting company owned by Margaret's son. The payments totaled nearly $50,000 over 6 months. I forwarded everything to Tom, who whistled when he saw the documents. "Bob, this isn't just a property dispute anymore. This looks like fraud, possibly even embezzlement." I stared out my kitchen window at the backyard they were trying to steal. "What do we do now?" Tom's voice was firm. "Now we fight back. Hard." Tom was right. This was bigger than just my backyard now. If the HOA board was willing to engage in what appeared to be fraudulent activity for financial gain, they needed to be stopped not just for my sake, but for the entire neighborhood. But taking on an HOA board alone is difficult. They have resources, legal counsel, and the power to make homeowners' lives miserable. I needed allies. I started with Susan, my longtime neighbor. When I showed her the evidence I'd uncovered, she was outraged. "This is exactly why I've never trusted that woman," she said, referring to Margaret. "What can I do to help?" Susan was well connected in the neighborhood. She agreed to discreetly sound out other homeowners, gauging their feelings about the HOA board and their potential willingness to support my cause. Meanwhile, I reached out to a few other neighbors I knew had had issues with the HOA in the past. There was Jim Peterson, who had been fined multiple times for parking his work truck in his own driveway. There was Maria Gonzalez, who had been ordered to remove a swing set from her backyard because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. And there was David Chen, a retired engineer like me, who had been battling the HOA for months over their refusal to approve his solar panel installation. I invited them all over for a backyard barbecue, a slightly ironic choice, given the circumstances. As we sat around my patio, I shared what I had discovered about the HOA's plans. "I thought it was just me they were targeting," Jim said, shaking his head. "I had no idea they were planning something like this." Maria looked worried. "If they're willing to do this to you, Robert, what's to stop them from coming after the rest of us?" David, ever the analytical one, asked to see the documents I had collected. He pored over them carefully, occasionally making notes on a pad. "There's a pattern here," he said finally. "The board has been systematically identifying properties with what they consider underutilized land and finding ways to reclassify them. Your case is just the most egregious example." By the end of the evening, I had 4 committed allies. We agreed to form a sort of watchdog group with the goal of monitoring the HOA's activities and sharing information. Susan called us Willow Creek Homeowners for Fair Governance, a bit of a mouthful, but it captured our mission. Over the next few weeks, our small group grew. More neighbors joined, some with their own stories of HOA overreach. We held meetings in my living room, sharing information and strategizing. David created a secure online forum where we could communicate and share documents. The HOA board seemed to sense that something was happening. At the next monthly meeting, Margaret made a point of emphasizing the importance of supporting the board's decisions and not spreading misinformation throughout the community. Her words were clearly aimed at us, but they only strengthened our resolve. We weren't spreading misinformation, we were uncovering the truth. Meanwhile, Tom had filed the lawsuit on my behalf, seeking a declaratory judgment that the disputed land was legally mine and an injunction preventing the HOA from taking any action regarding it. The HOA's attorney responded with a motion to dismiss, claiming that I hadn't exhausted all my administrative remedies within the HOA. It was a delaying tactic, and Tom assured me it wouldn't work. "They're just trying to run up your legal costs," he said. "Don't worry. We'll get past this hurdle." But as the legal battle continued, I knew we needed more than just a lawsuit. We needed to shine a light on what the HOA board was doing, not just to me, but to the entire community. And that's when I had an idea that would change everything. My military career had taught me the importance of thorough reconnaissance. Before making any major move, you need to understand the terrain, the enemy, and all the variables that could affect the outcome. I applied this same principle to my situation with the HOA. I had already uncovered the board's communications with Sunrise Properties and the payments to Margaret's son's consulting company. But I suspected there was more to the story, something deeper that might explain why they were so confident in their claim to my land. I decided to dig into the history of the land itself, beyond just the plat maps and property deeds. I spent several days at the County Historical Society, poring over old maps and records. What I discovered was fascinating. The land where Willow Creek now stood had once been part of a large ranch owned by a family named Harrington. No relation to me, as far as I knew. In the late 1990s, as the area began to develop, the Harrington heirs had sold off most of the land to various developers, including Texan Dream Properties, the company that built Willow Creek. But here's where it got interesting. According to the historical records, the Harrington family had retained ownership of a significant portion of the land, including mineral rights and certain development rights. These retained interests were supposed to be noted on all property deeds within the development. When I returned to the county records office, I asked Brenda to help me search for any mention of the Harrington interests in the Willow Creek property records. After several hours of digging, we found something curious. In the original covenants and restrictions for Willow Creek, there was indeed a reference to the Harrington retained interests, but in all the subsequent amendments to those covenants, including the one that the HOA was using to claim my backyard, those references had been removed. "That's highly irregular," Brenda remarked. "You can't just remove existing restrictions or reservations without proper legal process. Someone would have had to file a release or modification, and there's no record of that here." I felt a surge of excitement. This was the smoking gun I had been looking for. The HOA's claim to my land was based on documents that had been improperly amended, first by removing the Harrington interests and then by redrawing the property lines. But there was still one piece missing. If the Harrington family still held these interests, why hadn't they come forward? And how had the HOA board gotten away with removing these references from the covenants? I decided to try to track down the Harrington heirs. A search of public records revealed that most of the family had moved away years ago. But one descendant, a man named William Harrington, still lived in the area. I found his contact information and gave him a call, explaining who I was and why I was reaching out. To my surprise, he was already somewhat aware of the situation. "Robert, I've been following what's happening in Willow Creek," he said. "My family still owns certain rights to that land, but we haven't exercised them in years. We didn't think it was worth the trouble." I explained what I had discovered about the amended covenants and the HOA's plans. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "This is worse than I thought," William said finally. "The HOA board has no right to remove our family's interests from those documents. And if they're planning to sell land that we still have a claim to, that's a serious problem." We agreed to meet the next day. When I showed William all the documents I had collected, his expression grew grim. "They've been systematically erasing our family's connection to this land," he said, shaking his head. "And I think I know why." He explained that the Harrington family's retained interests included not just mineral rights, but also a provision that any development of the land required their approval, a provision that would effectively block the HOA's plans to sell to Sunrise Properties. "If they remove that restriction from the covenants," William continued, "they could sell the land without our knowledge or consent. That's not just unethical, it's illegal." This was the final piece of the puzzle. The HOA board wasn't just trying to steal my backyard, they were attempting to defraud both me and the Harrington family out of their rightful interests in the land. William agreed to join our cause. With his family's legal claim to the land, our position was now much stronger. But we still needed to expose what the HOA board was doing to the rest of the community. And that's when I decided it was time to go public. Armed with all the evidence I had collected, including the improper plat amendment, the communications with Sunrise Properties, the payments to Margaret's son, and the Harrington family's retained interests, I knew it was time to take our fight to the next level. Tom had already filed the lawsuit on my behalf, but legal proceedings moved slowly, and the HOA board was continuing to pressure me. I had received another letter just that morning, informing me that the fines had increased to 5-0 and that they were moving forward with placing a lien on my property. It was time to act. I called a meeting of our homeowners group now, nearly 30 strong in the community clubhouse. I had reserved the space under the guise of a neighborhood watch meeting, which seemed appropriate given that we were watching out for the community's interests. As I laid out all the evidence I had gathered, the room grew quiet. When I finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before Jim spoke up. "They need to be removed from the board. All of them." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. "But how?" Maria asked. "They control the HOA. They make the rules." David raised his hand. "According to the HOA's own bylaws, if 25% of homeowners petition for a special meeting to remove board members, the board must call that meeting within 30 days. We have enough people here to meet that threshold." William Harrington, who had joined us, nodded. "And if we can present this evidence to the entire community, I'm confident we'll get the votes needed to remove them." It was a plan. Over the next week, we drafted a petition calling for a special meeting to vote on removing the entire HOA board. We went door to door, explaining the situation to our neighbors and asking for their support. Not everyone was on our side. Some homeowners were loyal to Margaret and the current board, while others simply didn't want to get involved in what they saw as a messy dispute. But enough people were concerned about what we had uncovered to sign the petition. Within 10 days, we had the signatures of more than 40% of the homeowners, well over the 25% required. We delivered the petition to the HOA's management company, along with a formal request for a special meeting. The response was swift and predictable. Margaret sent out an email to all homeowners, accusing our group of spreading false information and attempting to disrupt the governance of our community. She claimed that the petition was invalid because it didn't follow proper procedures. Tom assured us that this was nonsense. "The bylaws are clear," he said. They have to call the meeting. If they refuse, we can take them to court to compel them. But the HOA board didn't refuse. Instead, they scheduled the special meeting for 3 weeks later, giving themselves time to mount a counter-campaign. In the meantime, we decided to go public with our findings. I wrote a detailed summary of everything we had discovered, supported by copies of the relevant documents, and posted it on our online forum. We also created a simple website where homeowners could access all the information. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, the story had spread throughout the neighborhood. More homeowners joined our group, and even those who had been skeptical began to ask questions. The HOA board tried to fight back, sending out their own communications that dismissed our claims as baseless accusations and misinterpretations of legal documents. But they couldn't refute the actual evidence we had presented. As the special meeting approached, tensions in the neighborhood ran high. Supporters of the current board and members of our group engaged in heated discussions in community forums and at neighborhood gatherings. It was dividing the community, but it was also forcing people to pay attention to how their HOA was being run. The night before the meeting, I sat on my back porch, looking out at the land they were trying to steal. I thought about all the years I had served in the military, fighting to protect people's rights and freedoms. Now, I was fighting for my own rights, right here in my own backyard. I knew that whatever happened at the meeting tomorrow, we had already accomplished something important. We had exposed corruption and abuse of power in our community. We had shown that ordinary people could stand up to those who tried to take advantage of them. But I also knew that the fight wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The day of the special meeting arrived with a tension that hung thick in the air. The community clubhouse was packed when I arrived, with nearly every homeowner in Willow Creek in attendance. This was unprecedented. HOA meetings typically drew only a handful of residents, most of whom were already on the board. Our group had arrived early to set up a projector and screen, where we planned to present our evidence. We had also prepared handouts summarizing our findings for those who wanted to follow along. Margaret and the other board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking uncomfortable as they faced the crowd. Margaret attempted to open the meeting with her usual speech about community and cooperation, but she was interrupted almost immediately. A homeowner in the back stood up. "Margaret, we're not here for a speech. We're here for answers." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Margaret's face tightened, but she nodded curtly. "Very well. We'll proceed directly to the agenda item regarding the petition to remove the board. According to the HOA's bylaws, the first step was to allow the petitioners, in this case, our group, to present our case." I stood up and walked to the front, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and determination. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady. "My name is Robert Harrison, and I'm here today because the HOA board is attempting to steal my property. But this isn't just about me. It's about the integrity of our community and the trust we place in those who govern it." For the next 20 minutes, I laid out our case in detail. I explained about the improper plat amendment, the communications with Sunrise Properties, the payments to Margaret's son, and the Harrington family's retained interests. With each point, I projected the relevant documents onto the screen so everyone could see the evidence for themselves. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting in murmurs and whispers. David stood up next, presenting a detailed analysis of the legal issues involved. Then William Harrington spoke, explaining his family's historical connection to the land and their retained interests. By the time we finished, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. Even those who had been skeptical or supportive of the current board now looked troubled. When it was the board's turn to respond, they seemed flustered. Margaret attempted to dismiss our evidence as taken out of context and legally insignificant. Gerald, the attorney board member, argued that property law was complex and that we were misinterpreting the documents. But they couldn't refute the facts. When pressed about the payments to Margaret's son, she claimed they were for legitimate consulting services, but couldn't specify what those services were. When asked about the removal of the Harrington interests from the covenants, she had no answer. The most telling moment came when a homeowner asked directly, "Did the board plan to sell common areas to Sunrise Properties?" Margaret hesitated, then said, "The board has a responsibility to explore all options for maintaining and improving our community." It wasn't a denial, and everyone in the room knew it. After both sides had presented, it was time for the vote. According to the bylaws, removing a board member required a majority vote of the homeowners present. With all 5 board members facing removal, we needed 5 separate majority votes. The first vote was for Margaret. When the results were announced, she had been removed by a vote of 87% to 13%, one by one. The other board members were also voted out, each by a similar margin. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Margaret and the other board members gathered their things and left without a word, their faces grim. In the aftermath of the vote, there was chaos and celebration in equal measure. Homeowners were talking excitedly about what this meant for the community. Our group had succeeded in removing the corrupt board, but now we faced the challenge of what came next. As the meeting began to break up, several homeowners approached me, thanking me for what I had done. One woman, an elderly widow named Eleanor, who had lived in Willow Creek since it was first built, took my hand. "Robert," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you've done a great thing for this community. Those people have been running roughshod over us for years. Thank you for having the courage to stand up to them." I was touched by her words, but I knew the fight wasn't over yet. We still had my lawsuit to resolve, and we needed to ensure that the new board would be more accountable to the homeowners. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of satisfaction, but also a lingering unease. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over, and I had a feeling that Margaret and the others weren't going to give up without a fight. The days following the special meeting were a whirlwind of activity. With the old board removed, we needed to form a new one to manage the HOA's affairs. According to the bylaws, the homeowners could elect a temporary board to serve until the next regular election. Our group nominated 5 homeowners who had been involved in the effort to remove the previous board, including David, who had been so instrumental in analyzing the legal documents. To my surprise, several homeowners nominated me as well. "I appreciate the confidence," I said when my name was put forward, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. My focus right now needs to be on resolving my property dispute." In the end, we elected a balanced board that included members of our group as well as some homeowners who had been neutral during the conflict. David was elected president, which seemed fitting given his analytical mind and commitment to fairness. The new board's first order of business was to review all the actions taken by the previous board, especially those related to property matters and financial decisions. What they discovered was shocking. In addition to the plans to sell common areas to Sunrise Properties, the old board had been misusing HOA funds in various ways. They had paid themselves excessive consulting fees, hired contractors without proper bidding processes, and made questionable investments with reserve funds. Perhaps most troubling, they had been selectively enforcing rules and regulations, targeting homeowners they didn't like while ignoring violations by their friends and allies. It was a pattern of abuse that went far beyond just my situation. The new board immediately took steps to rectify these issues. They froze all pending actions related to property sales, hired an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances, and established a transparent process for enforcing rules and regulations. Meanwhile, my lawsuit continued to move forward. Tom had filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the evidence we had presented was so clear that there was no need for a trial. The HOA's attorney, now representing the old board members personally, since the new board had withdrawn the HOA as a party to the lawsuit, opposed the motion, arguing that there were still disputed facts that needed to be resolved at trial. The judge scheduled a hearing on the motion, and both sides prepared their arguments. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Tom and I worked closely with William Harrington to gather additional evidence supporting our case. William had hired his own attorney to represent the Harrington family's interests, and together they discovered even more irregularities in how the old board had handled property matters. They found evidence that the board had been quietly amending plats and covenants throughout the neighborhood, not just in my case, in preparation for selling off various parcels of land. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed with homeowners from Willow Creek who had come to show their support. Tom presented our case clearly and methodically, laying out all the evidence we had gathered. The HOA's attorney, in turn, argued that these were complex legal matters that required a full trial to resolve. But when the judge pressed him for specific examples of disputed facts, he struggled to provide any. After hearing both sides, the judge took a short recess to consider his decision. When he returned, he announced that he was granting our motion for summary judgment. "The evidence presented by the plaintiff is clear and convincing," the judge said. "The amended plat cited by the defendants was not properly filed or approved, and therefore has no legal effect. The plaintiff's property boundaries are as stated in the original plat, which includes the disputed land." He went on to rule that the old HOA board had acted improperly in attempting to claim the land as common area, and that the fines they had imposed on me were invalid. It was a complete victory. As we left the courtroom, homeowners surrounded me, offering congratulations and thanks. Even the new board members were there, expressing their relief that this matter had been resolved. But Margaret and the other former board members were nowhere to be seen. They had left immediately after the judge's decision, without a word to anyone. As I drove home, I should have been elated. I had won my case, and the corrupt board had been exposed and removed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. And I was right. A week after the court's decision, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a man named Michael Reynolds, who identified himself as a private investigator. "Mr. Harrison," he said, "I've been hired to look into the activities of the former Willow Creek HOA board. I understand you've had some dealings with them." I was immediately cautious. "Who hired you?" "That's confidential for now," he replied. "But I can tell you that my client has a significant interest in ensuring that the full extent of the board's activities comes to light." I hesitated, then decided to hear him out. We arranged to meet the next day at a local coffee shop. Michael was in his late 40s, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He explained that he had been investigating Margaret Thompson and the other board members for several months. "What I've found goes beyond what you uncovered," he said, sliding a folder across the table to me. "Much beyond." I opened the folder and began to read. What I found was shocking. According to Michael's investigation, Margaret and the other board members had been involved in a scheme to systematically identify and reclassify valuable parcels of land throughout Willow Creek, with the intention of selling them to developers at below-market rates. But that wasn't all. They had also been siphoning HOA funds into shell companies and offshore accounts, using complex financial transactions to hide their tracks. The total amount they had embezzled was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. "This is incredible," I said, looking up from the documents. "But who hired you to investigate this?" Michael leaned forward. "My client is William Harrington." I was surprised. "William? But he's been working with us all along. Why would he hire a private investigator without telling us?" Michael shrugged. "He wanted to have his own investigation, independent of what you were doing. He suspected that there was more to this than just the issue with your property, and he wanted to be thorough." It made sense. William had seemed particularly interested in the financial aspects of the HOA's activities during our meetings. I wondered if he had suspected something like this all along. "Does William know what you found?" I asked. Michael nodded. "I briefed him yesterday. That's why he suggested I contact you. He thinks we should work together to bring this information to light." I agreed. This was much bigger than just my property dispute now. It was a case of massive fraud and embezzlement that affected every homeowner in Willow Creek. Over the next few days, Michael and I shared information. I provided him with all the documents we had collected during our investigation, and he shared additional evidence he had uncovered through his work. Together, we built a comprehensive picture of the scheme Margaret and the others had been running. The most damning evidence was a series of emails between Margaret and a real estate attorney who had been advising the board on how to legally reclassify property. In one email, the attorney explicitly warned Margaret that their actions were legally questionable and could expose them to significant liability. Margaret's response was chilling. "As long as we control the board and the records, no one will be able to prove anything. By the time anyone figures out what's happening, we'll be long gone." This email, combined with all the other evidence, painted a clear picture of deliberate, knowing fraud on a massive scale. We took our findings to David and the new HOA board. They were horrified by what we discovered and immediately agreed to take action. They filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, requesting an investigation into the former board's activities. At the same time, William Harrington filed a separate lawsuit against Margaret and the others, seeking damages for the attempted sale of land that his family still had an interest in. The response from the former board members was swift and predictable. They denied everything, accusing us of a witch hunt and sour grapes. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. Within weeks, the State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation. The FBI even got involved due to the interstate nature of some of the financial transactions. Margaret and the others were called in for questioning, and their homes and offices were searched. The story broke in the local news, then spread to regional and even national outlets. Willow Creek became infamous as an example of HOA corruption and abuse of power. For me, it was bittersweet. On one hand, I was vindicated. The court had ruled in my favor, and the people who had tried to steal my property were facing serious legal consequences. On the other hand, I never wanted this kind of attention or conflict. I had just wanted to enjoy my retirement in peace. As the legal proceedings continued, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. I spent time in my garden, read books on my back porch, and enjoyed the fact that my property was once again entirely my own. But the story wasn't over yet. There was one final twist that none of us saw coming. 3 months after the state and federal investigations began, I received another unexpected phone call. This time it was from Tom, my attorney. "Bob, you need to come to my office," he said, his voice unusually serious. "There's something you need to see." When I arrived at Tom's office, he was waiting with Michael Reynolds and William Harrington. They all had solemn expressions. "What's going on?" I asked, feeling a sense of dread. Tom slid a document across his desk. "This was just delivered to my office. It's from a law firm representing a client who wishes to remain anonymous for now." I picked up the document and began to read. It was a property deed, dated more than 20 years ago, conveying a large parcel of land in Willow Creek to a trust. The trust was named the Harrison Family Trust, my family's trust. I looked up, confused. "I don't understand. My family never owned any land in Willow Creek." William spoke up. "Keep reading." I returned to the document, my eyes scanning the legal language. As I read, my confusion turned to shock. The deed conveyed not just the land where my house now stood, but most of the property in Willow Creek, all held in trust for the Harrison family and its descendants. "That's impossible," I said, shaking my head. "I bought my house from Texan Dream Properties, just like everyone else. There was no mention of any trust or family ownership." Tom nodded. "That's what makes this so complicated. According to this deed, which appears to be legitimate, the Harrison Family Trust has owned this land all along. Texan Dream Properties was apparently acting as a trustee, managing the property on behalf of the trust." I was still struggling to process this. But how is that possible? Why would my family own land in Texas when we've always lived in the Midwest? Michael cleared his throat. "That's the interesting part. According to the documents I've uncovered, your great-uncle was a business partner of the Harrington family, the same family that William here belongs to. Together, they purchased this land decades ago with the intention of developing it someday." William nodded. "When the development plans finally moved forward in the late 1990s, your great-uncle had already passed away. The family trust continued to hold an interest in the land, but it was managed through a complex arrangement with Texan Dream Properties." I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb this information. "So you're telling me that I'm not just a homeowner in Willow Creek. I'm actually part owner of the entire development?" Tom nodded. "That appears to be the case. And what's more, it seems that Margaret and the others discovered this fact during their research into the property records. That's why they were so determined to claim your backyard. They were testing the waters, trying to see if anyone would challenge their claim to land that was actually part of the trust." I was speechless. All this time, I had been fighting to protect my property, never realizing that I had a much larger stake in the community. "But why didn't I know about this?" I asked finally. "Why didn't anyone tell me when I bought the house?" William sighed. "After the 2008 financial crisis, Texan Dream Properties went bankrupt. The records were a mess, and the new management company that took over the HOA apparently had no knowledge of the trust arrangement. When you bought your house, the title search didn't uncover this because the deed was buried in a series of complex transactions that were difficult to trace." Tom leaned forward. "The anonymous client who sent this deed believes that the former HOA board discovered the trust's existence and was trying to systematically gain control of all the trust property so they could sell it for their own benefit." I sat there for a long time, trying to process this revelation. All this time, I had been fighting to protect my backyard, never realizing that I was actually fighting to protect a much larger inheritance. "So what happens now?" I asked finally. Tom smiled. "Now, Bob, you have some decisions to make. As a beneficiary of the Harrison Family Trust, you have a claim to a significant portion of the land in Willow Creek. You could choose to assert that claim, which would give you considerable control over the future of the community." William nodded. "My family's interests are also at stake here. We've always considered your family's trust to be our partners in this land. We would welcome the opportunity to work with you to decide what happens next." I looked out the window, thinking about the community I had come to love, despite all the conflict. I thought about my neighbors, who had stood with me through this ordeal, and I thought about the peaceful retirement I had envisioned when I first moved to Willow Creek. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. "This is a lot to take in." As I drove home, my mind was racing. I had gone from fighting to save my backyard to potentially owning most of the neighborhood. It was an incredible turn of events, but it also came with incredible responsibility. What would I do with this power? How would it affect the community I had fought so hard to protect? And most importantly, what was the right thing to do? I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. My life in Willow Creek was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. The weeks following the revelation about the Harrison Family Trust were a whirlwind of activity. Tom and William helped me navigate the complex legal issues surrounding the trust, while Michael continued his investigation into the former HOA board's activities. The first order of business was to verify the authenticity of the deed and the trust documents. Tom hired a team of forensic document examiners who confirmed that everything appeared to be legitimate. We also hired a genealogist to research my family connection to the trust, which confirmed that I was indeed a beneficiary through my great-uncle. With the legalities established, we had to decide how to proceed. The trust owned approximately 60% of the land in Willow Creek, including all the common areas and even the land beneath many of the homes. The homeowners had purchased their houses from Texan Dream Properties, but the company had only been acting as a trustee for the trust. This created a complex legal situation. The homeowners had bought their homes in good faith, believing they owned both the houses and the land they stood on. But technically, the land still belonged to the trust. William and I spent many hours discussing how to handle this situation. We both agreed that evicting homeowners or trying to claim their properties would be morally wrong, even if it might be legally possible. "These people are our neighbors," William said during one of our meetings. "They've built lives here. We can't just throw them out because of a technicality in a decades-old document." I nodded in agreement. "Besides, that would make us no better than Margaret and the others. We can't use our position to take advantage of people, even if we have the legal right to do so." Instead, we decided on a different approach. We would work with the homeowners to formalize their ownership of the land beneath their homes, essentially selling it to them at fair market value. Any profits from these sales would go back into the trust to be used for the benefit of the community. We also decided to dissolve the HOA entirely and replace it with a new, more transparent form of community governance. The HOA had become synonymous with corruption and abuse of power, and we believed a fresh start was necessary. To implement these changes, we called a meeting of all Willow Creek homeowners. We expected some resistance, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. When we explained the situation about the trust, the former board's corruption, and our plans for the future, most homeowners were relieved. They had been living under the tyranny of the HOA for years, and the prospect of a new beginning was welcome. There were, of course, practical concerns. Some homeowners worried about the cost of purchasing the land beneath their homes, while others were concerned about how the community would be managed without an HOA. We addressed these concerns by establishing a fair payment plan for land purchases, based on each homeowner's ability to pay. We also proposed a new community association, with elected representatives and strict limits on its power, to handle common areas and community standards. The transition wasn't easy. It took months of meetings, negotiations, and legal work to implement all the changes, but in the end, we created something new and better out of the ashes of the old HOA. As for the former board members, they faced serious legal consequences. The State Attorney General's office brought criminal charges against Margaret and the others for fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The FBI's investigation revealed a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts used to hide the money they had stolen. In the end, Margaret and 3 other board members were convicted and sentenced to prison. The 5th board member, who had cooperated with the investigation, received probation and was ordered to pay restitution. A year after the special meeting that had changed everything, Willow Creek was a transformed community. The new community association was working well, with homeowners having a real say in how the neighborhood was run. The financial irregularities had been corrected, and the association's finances were transparent and accountable. My own role in the community had also changed. As a beneficiary of the Harrison Family Trust, I had a voice in how the remaining trust lands were managed. But I had chosen to take a step back from day-to-day involvement, preferring to let the elected community association handle most decisions. Instead, I focused on enjoying my retirement this time, with the peace and quiet I had originally sought. I spent my days in my garden, reading on my back porch, and visiting with neighbors who had become friends. One afternoon, as I was sitting on my porch enjoying the sunset, David stopped by. He was now the president of the new community association, and he had done an excellent job of guiding the neighborhood through the transition. "Robert," he said, taking a seat next to me, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you did for this community. None of this would have happened without you." I smiled. "I was just fighting for what was right, David. I never expected it to lead to all of this." David nodded. "That's what makes it so remarkable. You stood up to injustice, not knowing how far it would go or what you would uncover. That takes real courage." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You know," David said finally, "the Community Association is planning a celebration next month to mark the 1st anniversary of the new governance. We'd like to honor you and William for everything you've done." I was touched by the gesture, but I shook my head. "That's not necessary, David. The real honor is seeing how far this community has come. That's reward enough." David smiled. "That's exactly why we want to honor you. Because you understand that it's not about personal recognition, it's about doing what's right for the community." As David left, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. It had been a difficult journey, filled with conflict and stress. But it had also been transformative, not just for me, but for the entire community. I had come to Willow Creek, seeking a peaceful retirement, and I had found something more, a sense of purpose, a community of friends, and the satisfaction of knowing that I had made a real difference in people's lives. Looking out at my backyard securely and undeniably mine, I felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't experienced in years. The battle was over. The community was healing. And I could finally enjoy the retirement I had earned after decades of service to my country. It hadn't been the quiet retirement I had envisioned, but in many ways, it was better. Because sometimes, the most meaningful chapters of our lives are the ones we never saw coming. What would you do if you discovered you owned most of your neighborhood? Would you assert your rights or work with your neighbors for a solution? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 2 years after the HOA crisis, life in Willow Creek had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The new community governance system was working well, with homeowners actively participating in decision-making and a transparent process for managing common areas and community standards. I often found myself reflecting on the journey we had been through, the conflict, the revelations, and the transformation of our community. There were so many lessons to be learned from our experience. Lessons that I hoped could help others facing similar situations with their own HOAs. One of the most important lessons was the power of community action. When I first received that letter from the HOA claiming part of my backyard, I felt alone and overwhelmed. But by reaching out to neighbors and building a coalition, we were able to challenge the corrupt board and create meaningful change. I also learned the importance of thorough research and documentation. In the beginning, I had no idea about the improper plat amendment, the Harrington family's retained interests, or the existence of the Harrison Family Trust. It was only through diligent investigation that we uncovered the truth. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. There were many times during our struggle when I considered giving up, when the legal fees mounted, when the conflict divided the community, when the stress became overwhelming. But perseverance paid off in the end. These lessons weren't just abstract concepts, they had practical applications for other homeowners dealing with HOA issues. That's why I decided to start a blog, sharing our story and offering advice to others facing similar challenges. The blog, which I called HOA Justice, Fighting for Homeowners' Rights, quickly gained a following. I wrote about our experience in detail, from the initial conflict to the final resolution. I also offered practical tips for dealing with HOAs, such as 1. Know your rights. Familiarize yourself with your state's HOA laws and your community's governing documents. 2. Document everything. Keep records of all communications with your HOA, including letters, emails, and meeting minutes. 3. Build coalitions. Find neighbors who share your concerns and work together to address issues. 4. Be persistent. Change doesn't happen overnight, but consistent pressure can lead to results. 5. Seek professional help. Don't hesitate to consult with attorneys or other experts when necessary. The response to the blog was overwhelming. I received emails from homeowners across the country, sharing their own stories of HOA abuse and asking for advice. It was heartbreaking to hear how many people were facing similar challenges, but it was also inspiring to see their determination to fight for their rights. One email that particularly touched me was from a woman named Susan in Arizona. Her HOA was trying to force her to remove a wheelchair ramp she had installed for her disabled husband, claiming it violated the community's architectural standards. After reading my blog, Susan had gathered documentation about her rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act and had recruited neighbors to support her cause. Together, they had successfully challenged the HOA's decision, allowing her to keep the ramp. "Thank you for giving me the courage to stand up for myself," Susan wrote. "I never would have believed I could take on the HOA and win. But your story showed me it was possible." Messages like Susan's reminded me why I had decided to share our story. If our experience could help even one person avoid the kind of conflict we had been through, it was worth it. As I sat on my back porch one evening, watching the sunset over the neighborhood that had become so much more than just a place to live, I thought about how far we had come. Willow Creek was no longer just a retirement community. It was a testament to the power of ordinary people to stand up against injustice and create positive change. What would you do if your HOA tried to fine you for something you believed was unreasonable? A. Pay the fine to avoid conflict. B. Challenge the decision through HOA channels. C. Organize with neighbors to fight back. D. Seek legal assistance. Share your answer and reasoning in the comments. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I was working in my garden when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Robert, it's been a long time." I turned to see Margaret Thompson standing at the edge of my property. She looked different, older, more fragile, without the perfectly coiffed hair and impeccable makeup I remembered. There was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Margaret," I said, straightening up and wiping my hands on my jeans. "What can I do for you?" She shifted uncomfortably. "I was in the neighborhood visiting a friend. I thought I might stop by, see how things are going." I nodded, unsure of what to say. It had been over a year since she and the other board members had been sentenced. Margaret had received a 3-year prison term for her role in the fraud and embezzlement scheme. From what I had heard, she had been released early for good behavior. "Things are going well," I said finally. "The community has recovered. The new governance system is working much better than the old HOA." Margaret nodded, her gaze drifting over my backyard, the land she had tried to steal. "I heard. I also heard about the Harrison Family Trust. That was quite a revelation." "Yes, it was," I agreed. No one was more surprised than me. We stood in awkward silence for a moment. I wasn't sure why Margaret had come, or what she wanted. Part of me was still angry at what she had tried to do to me, and to the entire community. But another part of me felt a strange sense of pity for the woman standing before me. "Robert, I wanted to apologize," Margaret said suddenly, her voice trembling slightly. "For everything. For what I tried to do to you. For what I did to the community. I was wrong." I was taken aback by her apology. I hadn't expected it, and I wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you for saying that," I said finally. "It means a lot." Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I lost everything, my home, my reputation, my freedom, but the hardest part has been facing what I became. I never set out to hurt anyone. I just got caught up in it. The power, the money, it changed me. I listened quietly, sensing that she needed to say these things, not just for my sake, but for her own. After I got out of prison, she continued, I had a lot of time to think about what I did, about the choices I made. I realized that I had become exactly the kind of person I always despised, someone who used their position to take advantage of others. She looked directly at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Robert. I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. We stood in silence for a moment. The only sound, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. I appreciate your apology, Margaret, I said finally. And I accept it. What happened in the past is in the past. The community has moved on, and so have I. Margaret nodded, a look of relief washing over her face. Thank you. That means more than you know. She turned to leave, then paused. Robert, can I ask you something? Why did you decide to help the community the way you did? After discovering the trust, you could have claimed all that land for yourself. No one would have blamed you. I thought about her question for a moment. Because it was the right thing to do, I said finally. This community isn't just land or property, it's people's homes, their lives. Taking that away from them would have made me no better than the people who tried to take advantage of me. Margaret nodded slowly. I see. Well, thank you again, Robert, for everything. As she walked away, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I was missing. The conflict with the HOA had been resolved legally and financially, but there had still been this lingering emotional loose end. Margaret's apology, and my acceptance of it, brought a sense of peace that had been missing. I returned to my gardening, my mind wandering back over the entire journey from that first letter claiming part of my backyard to the revelation of the Harrison Family Trust to the transformation of our community. It had been a difficult road, filled with conflict and stress. But it had led to something better, not just for me, but for everyone in Willow Creek. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over my backyard, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the neighbors who had stood with me, for the legal team that had helped me navigate the complex issues, and for the opportunity to make a real difference in my community. Most of all, I was grateful for the chance to enjoy my retirement in peace, knowing that I had stood up for what was right and helped create a better future for everyone in Willow Creek. Have you ever had to stand up to an unfair situation in your community? What was your experience like? Share your story in the comments below. 5 years after the HOA crisis, Willow Creek had become a model for community governance. The system we had created, with its emphasis on transparency, homeowner participation, and limited power, had attracted attention from other communities facing similar challenges. I had become something of an informal consultant, sharing our experience with homeowners and community leaders from across the country. It was rewarding work, allowing me to help others avoid the kind of conflict we had endured. One sunny morning, I received a call from David, who was still serving as president of the Willow Creek Community Association. Robert, we have a group coming to visit next week from a community in Florida, he said. They're dealing with some serious HOA issues, and they've heard about our success here. Would you be willing to meet with them and share your experience? Of course, I replied. I'd be happy to help. The following week, I met with the group from Florida at the community clubhouse. There were 6 of them homeowners who had been battling their own HOA board over a variety of issues, from unfair fines to selective enforcement of rules. As I listened to their stories, I was struck by how similar they were to our own experience. The tactics, the abuse of power, the sense of frustration and helplessness. It was all too familiar. We've tried everything, said one woman, her voice trembling with emotion. We've attended meetings, we've written letters, we've even consulted with an attorney, but nothing seems to work. I nodded sympathetically. I know how frustrating it can be, but don't give up. Change is possible, even when it seems hopeless. For the next 2 hours, I shared our story in detail, how we had built a coalition of homeowners, how we had uncovered the corruption, and how we had created a new system of governance. I emphasized the importance of documentation, persistence, and community organizing. But most importantly, I concluded, you need to remember that you're not alone. There are probably many other homeowners in your community who feel the same way you do. The key is finding them and working together. The group left feeling hopeful, armed with new strategies, and a renewed sense of determination. As they drove away, I felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that our experience might help them avoid some of the pain and conflict we had endured. Later that day, I received a call from William Harrington. We had remained close over the years, working together to manage the Harrison Family Trust and support the Willow Creek community. "Robert, I have some news," William said, his voice filled with excitement. "Remember that parcel of land on the edge of the community, the one we've been keeping as open space?" "Of course," I replied. "It's one of the most beautiful areas in Willow Creek." "Well, I've been in talks with the local land conservancy," William continued. "They're interested in placing a conservation easement on the land, ensuring it will remain open space forever. They've even offered to help with the costs of maintaining it." I was thrilled by this news. That parcel of land was special, a wooded area with a small creek running through it, home to all kinds of wildlife. Preserving it for future generations was a wonderful idea. "That's fantastic news, William," I said. "What do you need from me?" "Your approval, for starters," William replied with a laugh. "As a beneficiary of the trust, you have a say in how the land is used." "Consider it approved," I said without hesitation. "That land should be protected for everyone to enjoy." As we ended the call, I felt a sense of pride in what we had accomplished, not just in resolving the immediate crisis with the HOA, but in creating a lasting legacy for the community. That evening, as I sat on my back porch watching the sunset, I thought about the journey we had been through. It had been a difficult road, filled with conflict and stress, but it had led to something better, not just for me, but for everyone in Willow Creek. I thought about the homeowners from Florida, facing their own battles with an unresponsive HOA. I hoped they would find the strength and support they needed to create positive change in their community, just as we had done. And I thought about the future not just for Willow Creek, but for homeowners everywhere. The HOA system was broken in many places, giving too much power to unaccountable boards and leaving homeowners feeling helpless. But our experience showed that change was possible, that ordinary people could stand up and make a difference. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I made a silent promise to myself to continue sharing our story, to continue helping other homeowners facing similar challenges. Because if our experience could help even one person avoid the kind of conflict we had endured, it was worth it. I had come to Willow Creek seeking a peaceful retirement, and I had found so much more: a sense of purpose, a community of friends, and the opportunity to make a real difference. And as I looked out at my backyard securely and undeniably mine, I knew that this was exactly where I was meant to be. What's your experience with HOAs? Have you ever faced an unfair situation with your homeowners association? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.